Hello, everybody. Welcome to the second part of today's artist talks. With us is Lawrence Lek. I'm really happy that he was able to fly to Ljubljana and will give this presentation, which I have no doubt will be awesome. The ones that you've been here for an hour and a half now, you've been able to see his film, Idol, that is also screened or like part of the installation he did for the Biennale. The installation is called Nepenthe Zone, and it's installed in the MGLC, in Tivoli Castle, in the Iskra Delta headquarters. I will now briefly present Lawrence, and then he will do the talk, and then together with Max Valencic, we'll do the Q&A, and you're of course invited also to prepare some questions. So Lawrence is a visual artist, filmmaker and musician who lives in and works in London. His practice is characterized by creating fictional versions of real spaces that speculate on future geopolitical movements and technological evolution. In his work, he draws from the fields of virtual reality, simulation, architecture, and electronic music. His works include, among others, the virtual world Unreal Estate, the dystopian Brexit simulator Europa Mon Amour, the video essay Sinofuturism, the CGI film Geomancer, the site-specific video game 2065, and the VR simulation No Tell. He has presented his work in the solo exhibitions Ghostwriter in CCA in Prague, Farside Freeport in Hick Basel, No Tell in Urban Kunste Ruhr in Essen, Idol in Sadie Cole's headquarters in London, among others. His animated feature film Idol that you've just seen was presented also at the Moscow International Experimental Film Festival, the Rotterdam International Film Festival, and at Transmediale last year in Berlin. Lawrence, please.
Thank you. Oh, wow. That's booming. Thanks so much. It's amazing to be here. Can I just ask anyone who's like a bit further away to come forward? Because I just prefer it to be a bit more intimate as a talk. Because thank you. It's just amazing having like a really intimate screening, and thanks for everyone who like stayed and watched. I really appreciate it. Yeah, thanks so much. So I don't know, I had this quite long talk prepared, but I just want to like reflect a little bit about the development of the installation I have here in Ljubljana and like how Idol relates to it and just the various things I've talked about before. Because for me, generally it's like halfway in between an artist talk and a director's talk, and where the ideas come from is kind of like important in a sense. So I've been using video game engines to build both virtual worlds that are sometimes interactive and sometimes exist as films for about the last 9 or 10 years. And originally they started off with this idea of what I thought about as site-specific simulation. So to think about the idea of, what does a site and place mean in, the virtual world? Of course, this is, pretty commonplace now, but one of my kind of fascinations was, how does your idea of memory affect your experience of a place, really? And of course, I made about 14 or 15 short films, and I was always wondering, like, why is there this kind of like glass ceiling with a certain method of production? It's like the difference between writing a short story and writing a novel, or having a short film or a feature film. What I didn't realize is that because of limitations of budget and time, really, like a lot of artist films have to become a kind of one-liner, like one situation or one joke brought to its logical conclusion, or one observation about history that's given a twist, and so on. So Idol was kind of I guess, an attempt to bring these ideas about memory and how repetition is used in music versus in narrative and in space to try and like weave together something that could either be seen as a feature film, it could be seen as a collection of music videos, or it could be seen in a way as this promotional video for this product in the film that is, this voice synthesis software. And so the way I make longer form works, generally it's like I don't necessarily start with building the world, because I kind of feel that, with digital simulation, because it's so, how should I say, there's no mark in it, basically. There's no trace of a gesture or anything like that that you would have in, analog art making. That I felt that what becomes really important is to start with the soundtrack first. And so I spent about 6 months with this idea of developing songs or sketches or writing an album, so that when it came to doing the animation and building out the world, I actually had a kind of timeline to tie it to. So, usually in film production, the conventional process is, you have a script, you cast it, you shoot, you edit, and you add sound and music to a finished cut. Whereas, of course, part of the freedom of, having a virtual world or game engine is that it exists in this liminal space between being a live thing, because everything that's happening is kind of happening in real time, as well as being this, like collage medium where everything is a potential film set, and you can add characters in that, and you can, I guess, choreograph how they interact, like a set of puppets. Technically, it's much more of a pain than that, but essentially this idea that you have a stage in which the characters are continually playing their roles, and you can, and that's a live thing, is something that's quite, interesting, and I was playing with in Idle. So before that, I kind of want to talk about a couple of early works in which this idea of like a fictional artist or fictional musician came about, because prior to that, like let's say there's in this project called Skyline, it's much more a site-specific project. So I'll just play a bit from the trailer and then talk over it.
呢個世界咪有啲嘢永遠都唔會變。我當然明白佢嘅意思。我應承佢用一個過來人嘅身份寫一個故仔。
So what we're looking at here, it's a simulator of a London Underground train line that's going between 5 different stations, and each of the stations is actually filled with artist-run galleries, because I made it for a friend's kind of independent project space festival in London called Art Licks Weekend, and so I thought that instead of making a project about my work, I would make a project about the other projects in this festival. So in this sense that I started trying to recreate like this tube line that would go between 5 stations, and it goes round and round of 4 or 5 stops. And in this sense, it's really interesting because, this idea of digital simulation essentially means that you have to recreate the assets, not just how things look in like this train or this platform, but you actually have to break down how they function. So that means that I'd have to kind of like observe a little bit more how the sequence of events in how a train moves, basically, because of course it's something that, we're so conditioned to, habitually conditioned in this kind of mundane everyday reality, that when I like sat down and actually like wrote down the steps, it's like train slows down, then you hear the engine, then there's an announcement, then there's the pneumatic sound of the gas releasing, then a beep goes, then the doors open, and then you can get out. So, what you take as, what I would take as, just instinct, basically stepping off the train, becomes this like observation of reality in which, you have to like break down these different elements to bring them together again. So it's kind of like, it's like set design in reverse. And for the so this is a map of the 5 different stations around. And so this was the first kind of video trailer I made in which I was playing the game live, and it's a video recording. And I was setting it to a soundtrack. In this case, it's from Stalker, actually. Tarkovsky's from.
нашего жизни, бескорыстности искусства. Вот, скажем, музыка. Она и с действительностью-то менее всего связана. Вернее, если и связана, то безыдейно, механически, пустым звуком, без ассоциаций. И тем не менее, музыка каким-то чудом проникает в самую душу. Что же резонирует у нас в ответ на приведенный к гармонии шум? И превращает его для нас в источник высокого наслаждения, и объединяет, и потрясает. Ведь все в конечном счете имеет свой смысл.
So, you know, what I find like interesting in you know, simulation as this kind of stage set, it allows me to bring together different samples and fragments of things that I was interested in. And this, you know, Skyline was an early project, so I wasn't thinking about actually writing a script. I was actually thinking of taking elements of other voiceovers or soundtracks in which the people in the film are also talking about another place. Like the first bit of the voiceover was taken from the Wong Kar-wai film 2046, where people are, you know, talking about, you know, this imaginary train line and this journey into the future and how memory would exist for them in that case. So this, you know, this idea of, you know, creating like a fictional artist to talk about things that I was interested in, I took forward in another project called Berlin Mirror, which was at institution called KW in Berlin, which is it's in Auguststrasse, which is a place in Mitte, which is a former Jewish ghetto in the city. And so talking to different people in the institution, in this case, I was like less sampling from other films and actually just kind of like borrowing from people's memories or people's kind of personal autobiographical history of the place. So in this case, I think this was more or less the first time I kind of wrote a really fictional artist. In this case, I created a fictional sculptor called Daniela Graham, who based on the American artist Dan Graham, who's interested in, you know, a public and private space, about, you know, sculpture as a form of, as a spatial practice, basically. But imagining Dan Graham being born in Berlin in 1942 instead of in Illinois in 1942, so that in a way the weight of history was really what their practice would be about. So I created this fictional monument because they're having their, it's their 100th birthday, and they're having their retrospective at the 2042 Berlin Biennale. And it's a way that also reflects on their personal history with the site as well. So I'll just play a bit from that.
Von Berlin, von meinem Leben, von unserem Leben. Ich wurde 1942 gegenüber der heutigen KW geboren. Mein Vater hat in der Margarinefabrik, in der sich nun die KW befinden, als Chemiker gearbeitet. Die Fabrik hieß Berolina. Der Name steht als weibliche Allegorie und Symbolfigur für die Stadt Berlin. Ich kenne diesen Hof gut. Früher bin ich immer auf den Walnussbaum geklettert, der in der Mitte des Hofes steht. Er ist auf jedem Foto der KW zu sehen, schief vom Wind. Wenn man genauer hinschaut, sieht man das Moos den Stamm entlang wachsen, aber nur auf der Seite, auf die der Regen fällt. So ist auch die Stadt, abgenutzt auf der einen Seite, neu auf der anderen. Die 4 Teile meiner Ausstellung verweisen auf das versteckte Potenzial der verschiedenen Räume der Institution: Hof, Projektraum, Ausstellungshalle und Filmraum. Der Spiegel im Hof ist ein perfekter Kreis, der die Fassade der KW schneidet und so positioniert ist, dass er den Berliner Dom reflektiert, wenn man unter ihm hindurchläuft. Wenn Schnee und Wasser darauf fallen, ändern sich die Spiegelungen. Eine meiner ersten Erinnerungen ist der brennende Dom. Ich weiß nicht, ob ich es wirklich gesehen oder mir nur vorgestellt habe.
So in my conversations with, the kind of both Berliners and, travelers who knew this place well, it made me, I guess, kind of reconsider and also think about the figure of the ruin, basically, the figure of the ruin in art, and why there's a certain, aesthetic of this catharsis of destruction that's frequently replayed in, in sculpture form, in painting, in destructive mechanisms that are used to create work. So anyway, I just was really thinking about how memory can reflect this concern with history, again, in this speculative installation at the museum. And in a really simple sense, in fiction writing, there's often a very kind of, it's really a fundamental form of fiction writing or poetry, this idea of personification or trying to like embody yourself or imagine yourself as another individual. So I, essentially quite simply imagined, if I was, this sculptor who didn't have any limitations, neither like self-censorship and like unlimited budget, what kind of installation would you make to kind of celebrate the city and your own memories of it? So that's where this idea of, having this mirror essentially reflecting the city itself came from. Something that would be completely impractical as a real-life art project, but something that might actually be feasible in the game engine. So going back to Idol, I guess, this idea of, fictional artists kind of, I guess, collapse together with this idea of, building a wider world-building sense of what that could be. In the prequel, so Idol is actually the sequel to a 2017 film I made called Geomancer. And so after, a few years of making these site-specific or like place-specific installations, I really felt that, because so many of my work was basically coming from where I lived or near where I live in London and Berlin or whatever, I wanted to explore a place that I grew up in and I'm very familiar with. So Geomancer, I'll just play the trailer silently. So Geomancer is about a not that silent. It's about an AI satellite. It's a surveillance satellite who comes down to Singapore in the year 2065 to in the hope of being an artist. In Idol, Geomancer is now this like super intelligent creator who can do music and rendering and everything. But Geomancer starts off with the AI satellite in space coming down to Earth. And at the time, I was thinking about some of the discourse that was being made about AI and, like human creativity. It was a time when there was the Go player Lee Sedol had a match against AlphaGo, this Go playing AI, and lost. So I thought about how can I reflect, these real-world circumstances, but refracted in the future to reflect on this, like, future history. One of the surprising things I found in my research as well, that was at least surprising to me, was, even though, we're talking a lot about futurism probably in this biennial and in general, why was it that even though China was obviously figuring quite large in discussions about industrialization, globalization, pollution, and many different socioeconomic aspects, there wasn't a much kind of playful, hopefully slightly subversive discourse about this problem from the other perspective. So I made this video essay called Sinofuturism, actually nearly as a byproduct when I was writing the script for Geomancer, because I was just surprised that there's so much stuff about Afrofuturism, Gulffuturism, whatever, out there, but there was not much that dealt with the same question from a more playful point of view. So I observed when I was researching AI in China that both the positive and negative ways in which AI and China are portrayed are kind of mirror images of each other, both in their kind of positive aspects, like, automation can save us, or, the Chinese way or system is one possible way out of the problem of, hypercapitalism. And on the other hand, actually, AI and automation will take away all our jobs, make human work useless, or Chinese labor will also make, human productivity useless. So there's that very simple observation. I just, typed in AI China on YouTube, on Youku, which is a mainland Chinese YouTube clone, basically, and found these really, two polarized ways of looking at the same conversation. So Sign of Futures is a video essay that tries to play with both these ideas in a more playful manner to, reclaim this certain space. So unlike my other work, it was really, a collage video essay in which I just took found footage from, using the same search terms and brought them together with a script that I had wrote. But in a weird way, I feel, unlike the CGI films in which I have to kind of create everything, this idea of having to make a video essay, it's like the footage speaks for itself in a certain way. That last clip was a Bitcoin mining farm, and quite often the person taking the video would show that day's newspaper, in that case with the Pope, just to show that's what day it was. And so this hour-long video goes through what I see as key stereotypes of Sign of Futures, which is computing, copying, gaming, gambling, labor, work, and addiction. So these cultural stereotypes that I kind of wanted to mesh together in a both, I guess, a critical but also more importantly playful way, because I felt that was missing from the the discourse and what I was seeing. So fast forward the next series of work, which is Idol, Geomancer, and this video game 2065. Was this idea of not just creating the fictional artists and not just this way of production that is native to game engines, but to create like a overarching narrative somehow, or this behind this series of work that I was making. One of those, which I was talking to Yasha about, was this idea of having this fictional corporation called Farsight. In Idol, Farsight is the evil entertainment and AI corporation behind the music product. In Geomancer, Farsight was behind this AI satellite, and so in 2018 now, I launched it as my one person startup, and this is the launch trailer in which it's kind of like trying to positively talk about what AI can bring humanity. So I'll just play a bit of that. So, now that, so sometimes in certain situations, I kind of think about having Farsight as this, evil empire kind of thing looming large over everybody, which is, leads me to, I'll briefly show the video from Nepenthe, which I just saw earlier this afternoon, and just talk about how I was thinking about, different things, this idea of, I guess, automated, mental health apps and all this kind of ways in which, the weird circularity of having, technology or humanity causing and also solving our problems at the same time. So when Tiasha invited me to take part, I was thinking of going back to this idea of site-specific simulation. So there's the main Biennale building, and we were talking about how entering into this space itself could, be brought into this, how should I say, back into this idea of, what remembering you go to a certain place is. So I was thinking about, I was reading about a psychological phenomenon called the doorway effect, and the doorway effect is basically when, you get up from bed or whatever, and you go to the kitchen, and you totally forget why the hell you're in the kitchen in the first place. And apparently, psychologists call this the doorway effect, and apparently it happens because once you go through this threshold of a doorway, whether you're going from one room to another or from inside to outside, all of a sudden, because the context, your whole your whole visual perception, auditory perception, your whole body feels that you're in such a different environment that it makes you, it basically makes your short-term memory reset in a certain way. So I was thinking about creating this sonic environment that is meant to trigger this particular kind of phenomenon called Nepenthe Zone. Nepenthe itself is, I think it's from Plato or something. It's a fictional medicine for sorrow. This idea that you take it, and people say that it's basically opium or whatever, but you take it and you forget your troubles. So I thought, what if this idea of the doorway effect and this fictional medicine kind of come together in this zone for forgetting? The video itself is basically it's a walkthrough of the building set to an ambient music soundtrack that I made earlier this year as well, and it basically cycles through the journey 3 or 4 times throughout. So I'll just play a few minutes from the trailer and then have a talk. Thanks, and have a chat now. And please ask any questions or, share any feedback. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Lawrence. This is Max Valincic, who will be also one of the Q&A correspondents. Maybe first if there are some questions from the public, otherwise we will just dive in to our notes. Okay. So there's a lot of stuff you already answered through your presentation, but I think we can like just go a little bit deeper, unpack some things further. Maybe because you finished with the piece that you did for the Biennale and mentioned that it's actually like the soundtrack is of the same importance, or if not even more important than like the video that is actually a recording of a walkthrough through actually a game that you constructed. And you're also a musician. Maybe you could like talk a little bit more about how music and sound design and engineering somehow features in your work. I remember watching a certain presentation that you did with Code 9, who you collaborated for the No-Tell piece, and you both were talking about sonic fictions and creating like world building through sound and music. So maybe we can touch upon that a little bit more.
Sure. I mean, I guess working on sound and sometimes working on music is two slightly different things. Just like working on text that is read and text that is written, I feel it's kind of the same thing. It's to do with language, but experientially it's a very different thing. I think when Code 9's idea of sonic fictions is slightly different, because I think he's mostly talking about sound, in a sense like pure sound in the absence of vision, or how sonic characteristics can be really like embodied or affective without necessarily having anything to do with vision, I think. For me, the fiction aspect is, I kind of deal with it a bit more literally, I guess, because I'm more interested in the idea of the simulation of reality, in a sense. So in a way, when I'm creating these worlds or these films, in all the elements, I guess, apart from music, it's a simulation. It's not abstract in any sense. Like if I'm saying it's MGLC, it kind of looks like MGLC, or if I'm saying it's Malaysia or Singapore or London, it is recognizable as that. That's not, of course it's abstract because it's in the game engine, but everything is symbolic of has a real reference to something in physical reality. So I guess music is just a way, extremely abstract in everything apart from if lyrics or language are used. And actually the soundtrack to Idol actually is slightly different from a conventional pop song, because in a way the film itself is also the story about how the album was made. But I also, just as a musician, I'd quite like just being a bit more like free and intuitive when I'm making things, as opposed to composing like a virtual world. And I think maybe the last thing is, usually as basically as a game designer or as building a virtual world or a programmer, you're always working towards the future. It's kind of like in architecture as well. You're always working. The kind of strange paradox is you're always working for something to exist later on. So the stage that you're working is always like speculative, basically. And so what I really like with doing live things in the game engine or live things in music is that there is an element of real time that is happening, or there's a space for improvisation to occur, which doesn't necessarily happen if you're composing everything. So I'm really interested in that live improvisatory space that music gives, I guess.
Okay, and you mentioned architecture as well, and that's your background is in architecture, right? And I remember from one of your presentations that I watched online, you were talking about world building and the place of, or like the role of the computer-generated imagery, or like even game engines and architecture in the world-building kind of process or project. And already through your presentation, we were able to see that kind of the films you do, like the videos kind of connect to each other. They all somehow belong to the same world as does the Far Side company. So is this like, maybe you could speak a little bit more about the practice. How do you, is this somehow organically developing, or do you have like a vision for a world that you want to build, or like how this process kind of is going on?
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question, because world building is used a lot, especially in terms of science fiction and so on. I think I guess from a how should I say, like an artistic point of view, the problem with working the problem with working with software is actually like everyone has the same tools, right? So everyone has the same programs, and in a weird way, like making art with software, or at least with computers, is literally just knowing which buttons to click. It's really crazy that actually how an idea of like style or personality, or in some sense like authorship, can emerge from these from a medium that's like purely synthetic, basically. So my I guess one of my aims is to bring together like just the stuff that I'm personally interested in, into like the script writing, into the music, into the set design and so on, because I feel personally that one of the problems with working with software basically is very often it's easy to resort to defaults, and everyone does. Like I have a default sky and default clouds that I've made purple. So somehow my question is always like, how do I both create like really like an identity for each work, but also like an overarching like arc of the stuff that I'm interested in? Because the reason I try and stitch these narratives together is, I'm really interested in economic and labor and social questions, but I'm trying not to answer them directly. So in a film, for example, I can have like Farsight's point of view, or I can have like Diva's point of view, and there's maybe some kind of conflict or like whatever dialectic that occurs, but it's never so clear what my own position is, because I also don't have such a clear position as a user of these platforms, and I'm using them to create the work, so it makes sense that I am as much part of the startup economy that I'm talking about as characters in the work as well. So that's some mirrors that happen within the process of making something.
And talking about Farsight, and I mean the whole installation somehow in the MGLC, as you mentioned already, the Idol film as well, but also the first video, the Nepenthe Zone. It somehow it could be just like some promotional material, produced by the company to kind of how to say, get us to buy these products, or just engage us in its kind of like the ideology or however. And I remember that from the interview that you did with Interdependence, you mentioned this kind of not looking at corporations necessarily as something that is evil, which is very much present in media critique and critique of new technologies, and especially computer technologies. And the trailer that you've shown for Farsight now, I mean, I was reminded of Facebook Meta somehow references. I mean, of course it was done before, but this is the rhetorics, this is their narrative. So what did you mean with that? So corporation not necessarily being evil, but that you try to look at it more in a more complex way, and how does it feature, how do you appropriate these rhetorics, and how does it help your work, as the films and the projects and the installations, to somehow have this Farsight as a company that is fictional but already somehow becoming real through making these installations?
Sure, it's a great question. I think, you know, in the a few things. One is that, you know, on a legal basis, you know, the corporation, it's a non-human, you know, it's a legal person, right? So I think it's like all, you know, political preconceptions aside, just on a legal basis, a corporation, it's the first and most common kind of non-human legal entity. In fact, I think Graham Harman wrote a kind of pamphlet on like hyperobjects or something, or like object-oriented ontology, which uses the example of the East India Company. East India Company was the British company that was responsible for trade with Far East Asia, basically. So the East India Company is what Graham Harman uses as the example of the corporation that is, you know, larger than any single individual. It is a kind of like a transhumanist being in the sense that, you know, it doesn't die, it just gets inherited, and to some extent it has its own kind of consciousness or hive mind given by its board of directors. But why that really spoke to me, which is interesting, is that Singapore, the island, was actually founded by a member of the East India Company. So, you know, Raffles, this guy's name is, was on his way to look for a port to trade to China. This was actually exactly 20 years before the first Opium War. So what am I trying to say? I'm trying to say, isn't it strange that a company employee with their own mission kind of sued, because they also had, what is it, like kind of royal authority to create a colony, created a country. So my main issue with, you know, having a really one-sided view of, you know, capitalism or corporations, not that they don't do terrible things, is that if I took it to its logical conclusion, I would essentially, how should I say, it would be a way of unraveling my own story or my own history, for example. And I think to some extent, like I'm saying with, you know, even my use of tools or my you know, place I literally come from, are so intertwined in that. It's not that it gives an excuse not to critique it, but at the same time, it's a really complex story, I guess. So anyway, my relationship with that corporation, or the idea of it, it's gets more complicated the more I think about it, basically. Yeah.
Hi, Lawrence. Yeah, maybe I can ask you, or maybe I'm interested in the question of Sino-futurism, and maybe how do you see it in relation to Orientalism? And before you mentioned Gulf futurism or Afrofuturism, but I'm not completely sure. But for example, in your case, you kind of intentionally embrace this stereotypical projection that the West projected in, I don't know, East Asia, or this kind of concepts like Neo-China, Rise from the Future, and stuff like that. So maybe, what was the intention behind, or how did you proceed with this project, or what was the statement you were trying to make with it, maybe?
Sure. I mean, I guess it's more. So I think it's interesting if you think of, like, you have various generations of you know, futurism, right? So in a sense, every generation of futurism, or every generation basically of technology or of people, has the ability to learn or engage with or discard and go against the past. So in a way, like, the genesis of, you know, futurism was the most kind of directly, you know, early 20th century group of artists and writers got together, wrote a manifesto saying, we believe in A, B, and C, this is great, let's do more of this. It gets more complicated, of course, with, talk about Orientalism later, like with Afrofuturism, because as you probably know, like, Afrofuturism is a term coined by a white music critic, basically, about a group of like generally African American artists who were active 10, 20 years before they coined the term. So, and Gulf futurism, if we can say that, learned from those previous two by two, well, basically like writers, artists, musicians of Middle Eastern descent, not necessarily from the Gulf region living there, but what does that mean? To embrace, the vision of the Middle East as, this kind of extractive economy, glossy place. It's much more complicated than that, but just to boil it down. I felt that for me, part of what I was saying about being playful with Sino-futurism is that, if I'm already like a 5th generation futurism, it's already recycled at that point. It's already recycled at that point, so I could use, I guess, the tactics of the first Italian futurism, which is manifesto-like. So it's like, if it's a manifesto, let's have like 7 bullet points, basically. Then if it's about Afrofuturism, in my conversations, I was thinking about how, not necessarily Afrofuturist theory or discourse, but Afrofuturist practitioners, who wouldn't even call themselves Afrofuturists, they were just doing their stuff, embraced their post or transhuman identity in order to overcome their historical problem, which was, slavery. Pretty intense. So how do you overcome that is maybe a way is to just say, actually, instead of appealing to Western humanism, which actually made slaves as much as, free people, they would just consider themselves as alien. So in a way, it's not like, hey, we're human too. It's actually, screw that, we are not human at all. So what I kind of borrowed from that was this embrace of the non-human representations. And in the my observations, if you look at, think about it. Every time you've seen a video of a Chinese factory, it's always in the same discourse, right? Either these people are being treated subhuman under working conditions, or there's 50,000 of them. The implication of that versus Fritz Lang's Metropolis with robots is exactly the same. So that's why I thought that the ideal avatar for the Sino-futurist would be an AI, to embrace that, because just like the factory worker, they'll work forever for no pay. They'll accept, they're capable of studying but not originality, like machine learning, and they're susceptible for various forms of exploitation. So, try and embrace that, but not in a didactic way. But I just felt, having recycled so many things already, it would be natural to think of it a bit more specifically like that.
Thank you, and slightly connected question. For example, what do you think about the question or the notion of creativity? Because in some of your work you make a strong distinction between human and machinic creativity or creative process or ways of expression. So do you think that there is this unsurpassable gap or some kind of truly qualitative difference, or is this question for you, or do you see it differently?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think, again, it's one of these questions that the more I engage with it, the more I'm personally quite ambiguous whether, what the difference lies. Like I said earlier, like if I just told you exactly where to click and what to type in, you would make idle, right? It's completely a replicable process, and of course that's the way that machine learning currently works, to dumb it down hugely, machine learning algorithms would learn from a huge corpus of data and arrive at some kind of mean average behavior from that to generate an output. The reason I'm saying it's ambiguous is, earlier on, I would think that I wouldn't have this like human bias, but I would think that it was a bit more clear cut. Not in the way of like, how do we anthropomorphize like the robot or whatever, how do we give it emotion, we personify it somehow. But actually, the more I thought about it, I'm thinking through, it's complicated, but I'm thinking through algorithms. I'm thinking through algorithms and this generally hazy memory I have that, when I give an artist talk, I backfit a narrative to it so it makes sense. But of course, when I'm going forward, I'm like, sometimes it's, you know, convenience. I'm like, I'm just going to use that cloud because that's convenient. And sometimes it's deliberate. But of course, at the end, you know, when you finish something and you're looking backwards, everything hopefully is, you know, gelled together where we don't know. And I think, you know, going back to the idea of, you know, Alan Turing's, you know, imitation game, the Turing test, it's just so interesting that from the outset, from literally the outset of an article that would define artificial intelligence, Alan Turing is talking about ambiguity, the ambiguity of differentiating between human and machine, and that is what would constitute artificial intelligence in a way. It's not, how should I say, it's not an intrinsic thing that an object has, it's an interpretation of how another system is behaving, you know? So it's what is it, like, ontologically speaking, it's not an intrinsic thing, it's a, you know, a bestowed perceptual quality that always needs another mind to I guess, qualify that existence, which I just think is so interesting.
What you were explaining now, and like what Max was asking, like I had a question that kind of relates somehow to this, and also back to the question of Sino-futurism and its relation to other futurisms that you mentioned, especially the, let's say, non-Western ones, as alienation being like a very important base for constructing this futurist idea, or somehow to envision a future where the alienated ones can be emancipated somehow. And I think that this alienation, like, I guess it features in you know, the parallels between, you know, the portrayal of Chinese industrialization, or like the Chinese workers as being like robots or like machines, and the AI on the other hand. But somehow with Sino-futurism, embracing this non-humanness is somehow embracing also the alienation of the process somehow of the industrialization. And I guess that then this also kind of goes back to the question of the relationship between the fake and the real, or the authentic, because a lot of times the critique of technology and its dehumanizing or inhumanizing or alienating effects is done through advocating for practices that go back to the authentic, or to, you know, failure as something human, or creativity as something that only humans possess, and so on. But in your films, can be also in reverse. So something that is fake or very generic can actually be more capturing or more emotionally invested than something that is very authentic. So how do you deal with this relationship between authentic and the fake, or like the inauthentic and the synthetic and so on?
Sure. I think, you know, going back to one of the cliches in Sino-futures is copying, basically. So I think one of the first clips that maybe about 5 minutes into the video is talking about, you know, counterfeit cars, basically, right? So you have copies of like BMW called like CMW and things like that in China, because copyright and legal protections aren't so enforced. So there's the copy and the authenticity. I think going back to actually the Turing test, it's also something that is, you know, if someone's wearing like, I don't know, has a like Gucci handbag or whatever, and it's a very good copy, then relatively few people could tell it's a copy. So I'm actually quite interested in like what am I saying? It takes another person to actually say this is real and this is fake. Again, it's not an intrinsic property of the object, because very often, for example, counterfeit Shanzai goods, they're made in the same factory, but just, you know, they fell into another box kind of thing. So, of course, in Sino-futurism, that's because I felt that, like, you know, in, let's say, humanist art discourse, generally, originality is it's a good thing. It's like, it's not only a good thing, it's one of the qualities that a creative being should strive for, basically. And even, you know, I was saying this thing about building things in software, like what gives something character, you know, I don't know, you know. So I think that's, it's just still a very open question with the authenticity question.
Yeah, maybe like a tangent or slightly unrelated question to what we were saying, but for example, the protagonist in Idol Diva, she is a part of, I mean, in a fictional environment, but nonetheless part of the, like almost in real world terms, you would say like a streaming culture. So I was wondering maybe if because in East Asia, or I know for China especially, streaming culture is really gaining ground and importance. And maybe if you have like a inside view into how the Chinese or this big Chinese social media platforms function, and in what way, for example, the like interactions or expression is different to what we find on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, or if there are some kind of different kind of singularities or different kind of futuricity there.
Sure, it's a great question. I think in Idol, I was also, you know, like in Geomancer, I was thinking of more this old school idea of artistic practice, which was about originality. I think in Idol, it was from this idea that, you know, originality is impossible, or if originality is sought out, it's just marketing, basically. Specifically in pop music as well, because I think in pop music there's a really interesting, you know, the needs are for it to be unique and also completely generic at the same time. And that creates, I guess, a culture where not just the individual star is, you know, disposable, and I think about, you know, like sad stories, every, you know, child star or megastar just implodes under the weight of too much exposure, you know. I mean, Michael Jackson, Britney Spears, and it's like they become, and talk about legal entities, they become like crazy hyper objects with, like, you know, no core, basically, because they're so massively distributed. But to talk about, you know, how social media platforms emerge in China as well is one of the facts about, as you know, I'm sure you know, is that in social media or in big data, the size of the user base is the key resource. You know, the user base is their capital, basically. So like if TikTok has 2 billion users and Instagram has 1 billion, then there's that conflict that's there. But all of the, I mean, let's say talk about TikTok. TikTok is a product of ByteDance, which is a Chinese-owned company, and ByteDance is one of probably about 3 or 4 surviving Chinese social media companies. So one of the issues with regulation on social media and in streaming, is, of course, is when does something, where does something continue being wholesome and family-friendly, and when does it become like OnlyFans and adult, basically? And a lot of that is to do with the regulation of, how should I say, with supervision, right? So, for example, on Twitch, right? Twitch doesn't allow private videos at all, private streams, because, you know, then it would become, that's like basically the only thing that would separate it from being OnlyFans. So in the Chinese social media landscape, let's say, TikTok or ByteDance were actually a more family-friendly version of short-form video content, because there was another one that was a bit more associated with, like, you know, 18 plus kind of stuff, and then that becomes like a big target for censors. So it's just very interesting that, because, you know, you see how Instagram, I was off Instagram for like 4 years, and now I rejoin and I'm like, holy shit, I don't recognize this stuff anymore. And, you know, like posting an image is just like 1% of what the platform does. Of course, because the functions have cannibalized what Snapchat would have done or what TikTok would have done. So it's just expanding more and more. So that's just talking about Instagram, is in a landscape with more regulation, you know, with more like more powerful lawyers. Whereas regulation, especially in, you know, mainland China, is such a powerful thing that, you know, companies need to keep track of. So you talk about this contrast between the corporation and the state. It's a kind of different dynamic that, because the user base is so large, the scope of experimentation, it's, how should I say, it's a bit too cliche to say it's more dynamic, but I think there's just less regulation, for example. And in technology, less regulation generally means faster development. And you see this in like cryptocurrency and stuff like that, you know? But social media is just a very particular case of that. But I think it's super interesting, yeah.
Questions from the audience? We have like 5 more minutes to discuss, so no? Okay. Maybe one last question. Also the installation for the Iskra Delta that you did, but also like Notel and a lot of the works that you've shown, they somehow show some kind of environments that are fully automated in a way, so that they're kind of evacuated of humans. Even in Idol, we have protagonists, but they're all somehow within the game. And this kind of idea of full automation, as it is, you know, in recent theory and kind of resurfacing and so on, in more techno-optimistic or techno-pessimistic senses, but also fully, like you mentioned with Geomancer, like a fully automated artist. What these kind of artists do, but with these installations, you know, the empty club environment somehow in MGLC, it also seems like these environments have fully automated audience or consumers. So, I mean, with the AI being the artists and like we know the bots being the users also in social media, like what is your kind of perspective of a future where full automation happens?
I think back to, you know, like people would, what is it, you know, let's say criticize television for being, I should say, like, I guess at the time television would have seen like fully automated entertainment, right? Or like radio would seem like fully automated sound and music. So I feel I guess one simple technical thing is that it's like never that fully automated. You know, every, you know, technical revolution, let's say, promises that fully like, you know, like a car would be fully automated transport, or like a coal power station would be fully automated heat. But time just shows how limited that perspective is every time. I guess in the hotel, my idea of fully automated, it's still in like a, you know, whatever, like industrialization 3.0 kind of way, where the automation that happens, it just means the work is invisible. You know, it's not like it's probably like massively polluting and toxic and all these things, but, you know, to the ordinary consumer, it's invisible. And that's why like Notel was this fully automated luxury hotel. And I think what's interesting in a hotel, for example, is that, you know, it's a mechanical environment that just happens to be, you know, run by humans. Because if you think about it, you know, the space where the guests stay and the space where the staff work are like totally separate. You know, sometimes you go down the wrong corridor and it's just where all the like laundry is, and you're like, it's kind of industrial scale, almost like a hospital. So my idea of fully automated is just 1 or 2 steps past that. But I'm sure, you know, many other artists are thinking about ideas where, you know, like there's no humans in the loop, or we're all like mushrooms, or, you know, brains in vats and things like that. But I think that's just the interesting thing. Like what we think is like convenient enough is somebody at some point in time will think of some other detail that can be automated or simplified somehow. Yeah.
Okay, Thanks so much, Lawrence. I mean, Lawrence is here until tomorrow, so I guess he'll be somewhere near if somebody feels brave enough to approach him and ask him
Please.
something. We will continue in 15 minutes with another talk by Slovenian artist Marko Pelhan, and we will touch upon some of the similar topics we talked now, but mostly in relation to his early works from the 90s. But please, tomorrow the exhibition is still open, so if you haven't seen the installation by Lawrence in MGLC, I highly recommend visiting. So, and thank you for listening.
Yeah, thanks everyone.